Today's episode of What's the Big Idea is brought to you by point A to point C to point K to point Q to point B. When we recognize that learning is rarely linear, we can create experiences that reflect the real people our students are, not the next page in the textbook or bullet points in the standards. Now, more than ever, being responsive in the moment to student development, curiosity, and intrinsic motivation should guide our planning as we continue to make our way through these uncertain times. Nonlinear learning. Check it out. Now on to the show. Welcome to What's the Big Idea? I'm your host, Dan Carney. Schools around the globe have learned some lessons over the past month plus. Some valuable, some hard, some truly eye-opening. One of the most important lessons we've learned, if I may rely on my unscientific study of colleagues, blogs, and social media, is that we're just not going to get through all that content. Remote learning, home learning, distance learning, whatever we want to call it, and however we do it, necessitates a need to slow down, strip out the non-essentials, and ask the big question, what's really important? I, for one, am excited about this development. When schools are forced to slow down, take a deep breath, and plan for something totally new, kind of foreign, it opens the door for professional actions like backwards planning, a close examination of scope and sequence, and maybe a scrutiny of planning docs and standards that have, until now, not really been questioned. With all of this in mind, I'm so excited to have Graham Fletcher on the show. Graham is a math specialist, but his approach and beliefs about his subject are perfect for all educators in this moment. He's been a classroom teacher and an instructional lead, and he now travels the world talking with schools and teachers about how they can bring true, deep understanding into their classroom practices. Graham stresses big picture planning, slowing down to encourage genuine understanding, and designing learning experiences that avoid false positives. You know, the students can answer on the test today, but next month they've forgotten everything. I hope you enjoy our conversation, and I really hope you can apply much of what Graham talks about to your own teaching, no matter the subject. Okay, I'm happy to be joined on the podcast now by Graham Fletcher, a math specialist who presents around the globe and has served as a classroom teacher and a math instructional lead. He can be found online at gfletchy.com and on Twitter at gfletchy. Graham, thanks so much for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Dan. Super excited to just get to chat, get to support you in your work and your listeners as well, for sure. Absolutely.
Thanks so much. I want to get into the work you've done, especially the grade level progression videos, which are fascinating, and some of your philosophy on education. But let me start with a couple of questions, general questions. What does it mean to understand math, and why is it important that we all do?
Yeah, I think, what does it mean to understand math? What a great question. For me, I think I'm 43 years old, and so I think about the way that many of us learned math, whether it be like within the last 20 years now. Like, there's been a huge shift in terms of how we learn and understand math. And I think what's happened is many of us memorized formulas, like we memorized tricks, rules, and procedures, and we were able to apply them in a situation that was just like a plug and solve with the formula. But for me, understanding math is the ability to be able to apply mathematics in a context that we might not be familiar with. So one of the things that kind of helps me parse out what it means is, as a teacher, do I learn math to solve problems, or do I solve problems to learn math? Those are two pedagogical shifts. So am I teaching you how to do the math, and do you really understand it when I tell you where and when and how to use it? Or would I rather give you a problem, and through that problem, you learn the interconnectedness and the relationships of the numbers that you're playing around with, and how to apply them in situations you might not be familiar with? Kind of a long-winded response there.
No, I like it, and I love the way you played it there with solving problems versus and learning math. Sort of how those can can kind of be flipped depending on the approach of the teacher. Why do schools take such shortcuts in math? Why is there always the rush to the math shortcut?
I think it's because it's the easiest, and it's the easiest way to do it. Like I can teach you a trick, or I can teach you a procedure, and that gets you the answer. So it's what ends up happening is when we just look at teaching math as like a fifth grade teacher or as an eighth grade teacher, we only ever really look at the mathematics in that one grade level. We never really look at it how it's connected through the whole continuum of learning mathematics. And so that's kind of that, like, let me show you a trick, but then we really get a false positive. So like you might pass the state test or you might pass this unit test. But then I think most of the teachers out there would agree that what we end up teaching in September, kids have forgotten by April. And because it's at such a surface level and it's not at that deep understanding to where we have to go back and reteaching the rules and re-memorizing those tricks that we didn't really learn in the first place.
Mm,
So it's almost like we get that false positive that we have an understanding because we
sure.
have the trick. And that's many of our resources support that understanding as well, where let me show you how to do the math, and then they'll give you the word problem next. But
Mhm.
why not use the word problem first and let the mathematics come through that?
Yeah. I think probably teachers in all subjects can relate to that false positive notion that you just said. In your work, you've stressed the importance of visual models and learning math visually. And actually, this is one area where the podcast medium fails because I'd love my listeners to see some of your visuals right now. Can you talk a bit about that, the importance of visuals when learning math?
I think for me, one of the it's kind of a rule of thumb that I've used for myself over the years. Like for instance, I think about in middle school we teach keep, change, flip for
Mm,
division of fraction by a fraction. And what happens is we have that rule, but for me it's the visuals. So I basically have a rule for myself to whereas if I can't draw a picture or model the understanding or the mathematics that we're playing around with, then I probably don't conceptually understand it myself. Now, granted, there's quite a few concepts in high school that they're just so abstract that you can't use manipulatives to represent those thinking. But for most of the part, in a K-8 understanding in terms of mathematics, pretty much all of the understandings that we're playing with can be represented through either manipulatives, or they can be used through some kind of representation through a drawing or something like that. And it's
right.
through that I really get to check my own understanding along the way.
Okay. And you demonstrate those very powerfully in your grade level progression videos, which are available on YouTube. And well, first of all, when I watch it, I think this is brilliant. I think every subject should try something like this. Deceivingly simple, maybe. It's just you and butcher paper, and you've got kind of a sped up time lapse with your voice. So you talk a bit about how you came up with the idea for those videos and why you think they're so effective.
I think it basically one of the biggest things that when I'll talk with teachers is they'll be like if I was thinking of a YouTube video and you go and you look at how to learn mathematics on YouTube, like you can go to Khan Academy, you can go to YouTube, and many of the models that people are sharing online are just naked numbers or an algorithm, and they might use a drawing. But one of the questions that always gets brought up for me in terms of my role as a math specialist and supporting teachers and even students as well is what does this look like with manipulatives? So the way that it happened is I wanted to kind of show the flow of using manipulatives for each of the grade levels. And I was trying to do it on a whiteboard, but then I realized that I didn't have all the magnetic manipulatives that I would need to go ahead and create it.
Mm.
So that's where it ended up getting dropped down onto the floor with the camcorder, with on the camcorder, my phone over top on it with a phone, and then basically looking down and playing with the manipulatives. But I think it's that connection between the quantities, but they're both visual quantities when you're looking at the manipulatives. And I think one of the things that makes it so consumable for teachers is that it doesn't take up their time. Teachers don't have enough time at all. So how is it that I can give you a lot of information that basically wets your whistle, gets you intrigued and gets you engaged, and maybe you've seen something in that video to where you might say, ah, I never saw that, and that pushes you to go do more research behind that. So that is like a tip of the iceberg kind of thing, but it has to be consumable within that 6 to 7 minute window.
Yeah, what kind of feedback do you get from teachers as you travel around, and how it shapes the way they see teaching math?
So I kind of I see two different things here. I see many teachers want to look at that progression video and then teach that progression video explicitly, exactly as it's taught. And to be honest, I would want my own daughters. I have two, my wife and I, we have two daughters. We have a 10-year-old and a 13-year-old. And I would like for them to maybe not even go through that progression. I would like for them to maybe look at those numbers more flexibly. Like that progression is very linear in its thinking.
Mhm.
And let's be honest, like thinking and learning is not as linear as what happens within those progressions. It's more of like a 60,000-foot vision of what it could look like and basically a framework. And then it's our job to fill in those little nodes and nuggets along the way.
Mhm. And to your point about learning not being linear, in your progression videos, you come back to this idea that students need to understand math, but we can't tell them how to do it. What does it mean for students to figure out the math on their own, and why is that more important than teachers simply modeling what to do?
So for me, that's the retention. I read a really great book called Making Sense from Thomas Carpenter and James Hibbert and one crew of amazing authors and math researchers, and they had talked about leaving a mathematical residue. And so, what a mathematical residue is, you'd use a really rich task, and maybe students don't make their way all through that problem and necessarily get the right answer, but it's that messing around and that causing that disequilibrium in their understanding that leaves a mathematical residue, so that maybe in 2 3 days when we come back and we try the same mathematics but through a different context, through a different problem, they now build on that understanding that's already there. So what happens is, there's two types of really like learning. There's interleaved practice and then there's massed practice. And so for me, the what most of our textbooks and most of our resources, they have this massed practice approach to learning, where we're going to do this strategy on Monday, this strategy on Tuesday, this strategy, and it's this blocked practice that doesn't really allow for retention. So using these really rich tasks, it's interleave practice, to where we introduce something, we build a mathematical residue, and then we leave it, and then we come back. It's not, I wouldn't say it's spiraling, because we're not really adding to the understanding. We're cycling back and building on an understanding that's already there.
Hmm. Do you think curriculums are just too jam-packed full to even allow for things like interleaving?
Absolutely,
Hmm.
absolutely. I think many resources. I know that many resources are built from a page-to-page mentality.
Hmm.
So, say in a 180-day curriculum, in a 180-day school year, we have to have 180 lessons. Where I think what happens is as we become, I think about being a cook in a kitchen. As you begin to start cooking, I think about when I was married, when I was first married. When I'm in a kitchen, I'm using that recipe book all the time, and I'm continually going to it. I don't want to screw up. I don't want to kill my wife with my cooking. But then over time, what ends up happening is I begin to say, "Oh, I remember what I did last time, but it needed a little bit more of this." And then eventually, the recipe book starts staying on the shelves. And so, what happens is, a lot of times, and specifically with elementary school teachers, elementary school teachers, they have to be the cook, they have to be the baker, they have to be the breakfast maker, because they're teaching so many different subjects. So that curriculum is so jam packed with resources, because it's the only recipe book that they know for that subject.
Hmm.
But then as you get to middle school and high school, teachers can move away a little bit more from the curriculum, because they have that little bit more time and that little bit more flexibility. But it's always comfort food to go back to that recipe book of the curriculum.
Sure. Yeah, let's actually talk about middle school and high school for a minute. That's where I teach at middle school, and so I see already the math tracks. Students arrive in grade 6, and already the discussion is, okay, which track are you going in? And there's a lot of pressure from parents. I want my child in a certain track because I want them to achieve a certain level by high school. What's your feelings on the current state of math tracks in America, and what's sort of your ideal for that? How would you envisage uh, a track for math for a student?
Yeah, that's definitely a slippery slope. With me, have my wife and I having one in middle school right
Hmm.
now. I think it brings up a huge issue for me in terms of equity, where a lot of students that have access to the tracks or their parents know of the tracks push to get those kids in those tracks. But what happens then is when you look at the different schools, many of the times, some of our most underserved schools don't offer the same tracks that the more affluent schools do. So there's definitely a huge equity issue that gets pushed to the forefront in terms of me. I want to make sure that all students have access to the same tracks as possible. But then also thinking about like, well, what happens if a student's in sixth grade and they don't get in on that track, but then they're a late bloomer in terms of their mathematical understanding. They start really flourishing as a mathematician in eighth and ninth grade. And then in doing that, they're now not in the track that they need to be in.
Mhm.
So I think putting kids in tracks and leaving them in those silos for 6, 7 years is a very scary thing.
Mhm.
So trying to make it as fluid as and open as possible. I don't think there's a silver bullet, but I don't really know if tracks are the answer.
Yeah. We, I certainly was brought up to think this way, and I know even today this mentality exists that calculus is the gold standard. Calculus is what we all should be aiming for. What do you say to parents that ask, "What math is right for my child?" And I realize every child's going to be different, but what do you think students should be striving for ultimately to have the most flexible understanding of math and to be ready to use math in the real world?
That's I think about like I think through a K-8 understanding, most all of that mathematics is pretty much needed in some relationship or not as we move out into the real world. Now, some people uh, won't need mathematics for what they're doing, the high school mathematics that we're actually after. So I really think it comes down to student choice and the pathways that they're choosing. Not every student needs calculus. If you're going to be a historian, you probably don't need calculus. Now, somebody might prove me wrong, which is great, but yeah, so you might not need those upper level math classes for everything. So I think looking at the individual student and finding out what they want to do and where their interests are. But in terms of a K-8 understanding, I think everybody needs to have that solid K-8 understanding.
How can schools partner with families to ensure that the type of conceptual math learning that you're describing continues at home and doesn't sort of revert to the parent saying, well, I don't know. This is how I learned it. I learned the algorithm. Let me just show you this. What kind of partnership can schools form with families?
I think the times that we're in right now are providing us an opportunity to where we can definitely support our not like our communities and all of our shareholders. My wife's a school teacher as well, so and I'm sitting here and we're trying to plan ideas and how can we support the parents. Parents are getting frustrated, so I think these are they're trying times right now, but I think something really good is going to come out from this. How can we virtually support parents at home who are working with their students? But then we also have to think about the again that equity gap. So how do we reach those families that don't have internet at home? How are we reaching and connecting with them? So I think workshops, in-person workshops, when things kind of get back to normal, but then also maybe creating smaller videos such as the progression videos that support micro videos that support the learning that's happening in the classroom. And I think one of the things where I would screw up a lot is I would send homework home with a student, but the student didn't really have ownership of the work that they were doing. So it's basically now asking the parent to do the teaching that I should be doing as the teacher. So one way to avoid that mom and dad or grandma who really none of us want to screw up any kids. We only can support them the way that we know how to support them with the way that we learned. So really what we could do then is maybe only send things home with students that they already have ownership of so that mom and dad aren't having, or grandma or aunt or uncle aren't having to undo the learning that we're doing at home.
Okay. How about math games? Do you use math games in your own practice or at home?
Yeah, lots. So for me, when we talk about becoming fluent, math games are a key piece of that. Like once students have an understanding, what they need is they need that repetition to help build the automaticity of the strategy that they're trying to develop. And I think games are a great way because many times kids will be playing games and they don't even realize that they're really learning math because now it's a strategy game. So trying to have a strategy game whenever possible, and not so much like a roll and record kind of game, to
Mhm.
where just roll the dice and add the two numbers, where there's more strategy involved in what's happening. But whenever possible, me and my girls, we're always playing games, and whenever we're in classes, we're playing games for sure.
Right. If you were writing the Graham Fletcher mathematics homework playbook, what would that look like? What is maybe an upper elementary and a middle school math homework playbook look like?
Games would definitely be a big part of it.
Mm.
Games would be a really big part. Also, trying to find tasks in like the real world. A lot of the tasks that I create come from they're 3-act tasks, which were created by Dan Meyer originally, and it's like a 3-part lesson where you pose a video, and then it gets kids asking, what do they notice, what do they wonder. So launching rich concepts with these really rich tasks is where we probably start as much as possible. So not let me show you how to do the math, let me put you in a situation that causes that disequilibrium through a problem, and
Mm.
then through that we could have the more direct instruction after we've played around with the numbers first,
Mhm.
and then following up with the game at the end.
I want to shift back to this moment that we're in. You mentioned it, and the disruption that we're in due to the coronavirus. What are you hearing from teachers, from instructional leads, from school heads about what might happen on the other end of this? How might school education, and maybe more specifically math, be affected by these last few months?
That's a really interesting question, because I think right now we don't have the capacity to teach virtually. So there's definitely going to be some gaps. There's going to be lots of gaps in student learning. So I think one of the things that we need to be immediately cautious and aware to is, before, like my daughter, who's now in 4th grade, moving to 5th grade, next year when we start school, assuming that we start back up on time, instead of diving into those 5th grade standards, maybe we pump the brakes and play around in those 4th grade standards that she missed first, instead of just trekking forward. I
Mhm.
think we're going to have to be really intentional about bringing the whole social aspect of school back, but then also playing around with ideas and not making it so much where we're trying to drive understanding home. We're playing around with these ideas that they were trying to learn during the spring this year.
Yeah. Do you worry though that some schools will just try to get right back on the track and just keep moving forward?
Totally.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think that's it. Or for instance, or they might do it, and they might do it very superficially, where we come in and like, okay, we'll review last year's spring in 2 weeks,
Hmm.
and it's done in like a packet, and then it comes back to that retention thing. Well, you're about to build everything in 5th grade on a shaky foundation that wasn't really established in 4th grade, but you tried to do it in 2 weeks.
Right.
So I think being very mindful and intentional about, this is a different circumstance that we're under, so it's okay to go slow so that we can go fast later.
I want to talk a bit about your own just general approach to classroom pedagogy. You have this video that I called "The Less I Talk, the More I'm Listened To." A talk you gave, I think, at a conference. It was great, and you make several good points. But there's one I wanted to focus on. One that I found myself nodding to was this idea of where teachers stand in the classroom is important. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, it's so so like for instance, like if you could heat map where you spend the time in your classroom, you would probably be spending it majority at your time. Your floor would be lit up at your desk. Your floor would be lit up at the board, and it would probably be lit up with one kid. And so what I started thinking about was, I didn't realize that retail stores actually use heat mapping. And so what they do is they find out where people are walking through the store and the track that people are taking, and items that are hot items, they'll move off the track, and they'll put items that aren't selling where the majority of people are selling things. So I was thinking about it, like what would happen if me as a teacher, if I was to wear a heat map, or set up a heat map in my classroom, and watch where I spend most of my time in a classroom. Because I think, like, if you were to have someone sit in your classroom and just put an X every minute where you spend in the classroom, you're probably going to be spending it in one more area than the other, which again then becomes an equity issue because you're not serving every student where they need to be met. It's much easier to talk to a student who has an understanding than a student who doesn't have an understanding. But it's those students who don't have the understanding where we should probably be lit up a little bit more because we're asking those questions to push their thinking.
Yeah.
But I think it's very, very telling where we stand in the classroom for sure.
And you link this to a bigger point about the importance of asking questions. And I hear this a lot when I speak with people and just people in my own building, teachers. We somehow we understand that asking good questions is better than talking, delivering content. But yet, I feel like a lot of teachers are still kind of uncomfortable with that. They get into the classroom and they feel like, okay, well, now the lesson's starting. It's time to start delivering content. And I know we had that great conversation in the lunchroom about asking great questions. How can we help teachers get to a place where they feel like I can talk less if I'm asking good questions?
I think for me, I wanted to be a person that asked good questions in classroom. But what I realized is that if I'm not even asking questions, I can't ask good questions.
Mm.
So maybe one thing that I would try to focus on is as you begin to make this shift to a good questioner is just focus on the frequency of your questions. Because if you're not asking questions, you can't ask good questions. So even if they're not really good questions, okay questions are better than no questions. And what I found is the more that I start asking questions and the more that my content knowledge would grow, I can ask one meaningful question that would take place for all of the talking that I would have done. So I would focus on the frequency of the questions and not necessarily asking good questions first.
Mm.
And then as your frequency picks up, for instance, every single question that I'll ask students in a class turns into a turn and talk. So instead of me, and it's crazy how it kind of would look because I'll ask a question and kids turn and talk for 10 seconds and then we come back to where it's not just me asking a question and one kid answering and then me asking a question and one kid answering. Now, we need those 4 or 5 kids that always answer during an observation, but for the most part, it's only ever those 4 kids that we take along the journey with us. So by allowing every question turning into a turn and talk, what it does is it gives me 15 seconds to wrap my head around my next question, but also listen to every kid talk about what it is that question was, which now sets me up for my next question.
When you're in a math classroom, what are you looking for when you walk into a math classroom that tells you that students are thinking?
Noise.
Mm.
No noise. It's loud. It's like organized chaos. And so a lot of the times when kids are talking, that's a really good thing for me. If it's loud, that's a really good thing for me because what I know is I've been very intentional and purposeful with setting up the lesson with a really rich task that makes math social. I get really alarmed if I'm in a class and kids aren't talking. So, but yet just walk into a class and hear the noise, it looks like chaos. But if you were to go stand next to a group of students and listen to what they're talking about, it's beautiful. So for me, the noise is a shoe-in because math is a social sport, and I want kids talking and bouncing ideas off of each other as much as possible.
Hmm. And how about assessment? What does quality math assessment look like to you?
It's ongoing for sure. So I think so. I look at like most of us, we've all heard the terms formative, diagnostic, and summative assessment. So I think right now we have so much summative assessment, and for me as a classroom teacher, summative assessment sucks because it's the end of the unit. The unit is dead. It's the autopsy of learning. There's no more learning taking place. Like for instance, thinking about this, if you were to do a summative assessment, you do it on a Friday, you'd grade it over the weekend as you realize that your kids haven't learned anything for the past 6 weeks. And you make this big long list of kids that you need to go back and remediate with on Monday, but you can't because your district pacing guide says that a new unit should be starting on Monday. So for me, summative assessment doesn't work. Now it's great for district personnel, administrators to see the trends in data. But for me, assessment should be formative and ongoing all the time. Could be as simple as you do a whole lesson and then you throw a couple numbers up on the board and you have kids write it on a Post-it. It doesn't have to be the whole formal 15-page test. The more that I can catch students and their learning in the moment, the more that I can leverage that to move their thinking the next day and then the next day. I think a lot of the times we kind of teach a lesson, box it up, teach a lesson, box it up, and then do a summative assessment at the end of the unit, and that's it. I would much rather say, don't worry about the summative. Let's use formative along the way, because if we truly use formative assessment, then the summative assessment's already done by the time we get there.
Yeah. I was speaking with someone yesterday who said that in her view, summative assessments really are for adults. They're not for students. And it sounds like what you're describing is assessments that work for the students, that and the importance of that feedback.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a great point, because I think, who is the summative assessment for? Because most of the time we give kids a test, they get back a grade and they're like, oh, well, I passed. Oh, well, I failed. And that's it. There's never anything that comes from that. I think the big piece for me is that the only time that the right answer matters for me is during summative assessment. Up to that point, along the way, the formative assessment, I'm looking at not the right answer, but I'm looking at all the crock pot thinking that took place before we got to the meal was served. Like, what's going into the thinking? How's it percolating? How's it just marinating there? Where's their thinking at? What are they grappling with? And by asking those questions, that allows me to move their thinking forward, for sure. Absolutely.
At the end of one of your progression videos, you say, the turtle won the race. Can you explain why you said that and what you meant?
Yeah, I said a little bit earlier, go slow to go fast. Mm-hmm. Like, I think so many times we want to be, like, I don't know, like, as many times as I've seen that race, the turtle and the hare, the turtle always wins it. Like, it doesn't matter what book I read, what video I watch, the turtle always wins it. And I find that many times as teachers, we're the hare. Like, we want to be that hare teacher. We want to be the first to be in this unit. We want to be the first to be done this. Or like, our bulletin board for 2032 is already layered under the other 12 years. So we just strip it down at the end of a year. But I think what happens is when I go slow and I'm intentional and I'm purposeful along the way, that I don't need to go back and keep reteaching things. But the hare teacher will teach something and then have to go back. And they're repeatedly going back to reteach things because they sped through the race of teaching too quickly. So where is it that I can be? Every single step is intentional in terms of moving to a place. It's not just running through the curriculum as fast as I can. For me, I think the biggest thing is going slow to go fast, though. Let's not rush. I think what we've done, our track record shows that we've sped through a lot of things, which gets us in this predicament that we're in right now. So yeah, definitely going a little bit slower, allowing our thinking to marinate.
Yeah. Well, Graham, I want to thank you so much for joining me today. What I like about your work so much is that it's not just about math; it's about all our subjects, and I think your philosophical approach is something we can all learn from.
Well, yeah, I definitely appreciate the opportunity to come here, just chat with you, and yeah, just kind of share some thoughts. And I definitely appreciate it.
A big thanks to Graham Fletcher for that conversation. We're teaching and learning and living in some very uncertain times, and with school districts thinking about the fall, and with a lot of those plans closely resembling what we're doing now, we need to consider that school may never be the same. And in some ways, let's hope so. Because if something good is to come out of all of this, it just might be that we slow down, focus on what really matters, and consider how students really learn. Thanks for listening to What's the Big Idea? Check us out on Twitter @BigIdeaEd, where I'm going to post some resources from this show, including some of Graham's progression videos, which are very cool. Even if you're not a math teacher, in fact, if you're not a math teacher, check those videos out. It really had me thinking, and they're definitely worth taking a look at. All right. Thanks for listening, everyone. Check us out next time.